Hey, we're going to talk about something called the Enlightenment Era today. And the Enlightenment Era is a really, really fascinating time that unfortunately doesn't seem to get its due, at least not in schools or high school anyway, or middle school, because there's so many other things to talk about. We never really have a chance to really discuss what the Enlightenment period was all about. But the reason I like the Enlightenment period so much is because so many other things that we do study about came from this time period. And we want to talk about even our local government. We talk about our freedoms and our rights. We talk about freedom of speech and pretty much our right to religion. Um, Pretty much anything that we enjoy in our country as the United States can be tied to the freedoms that were created or first dreamt up during this Enlightenment period. In the Enlightenment period, I use a lot of yellow to references because there's some big ideas that I want you to know, and big ideas always using yellow or keywords, that type of thing, special names. But also, I use these images, and these images are drawn to help us think or picture what this term actually refers to. And when we talk about the Enlightenment era, we're really talking about where people's minds just kind of open up and they can see the world in a different way. And it's almost like a light bulb flipping on. Now, some of the biggest weight from the Enlightenment period is going to come between the 16 and 1700s, but it really started way before then. And there's some specific people who were involved in the Enlightenment era that need to be mentioned that we won't get to talk about today. But I'm going to focus on one of them, a guy named Rene Descartes, and I'll talk about him in a few minutes here. But let me talk about what the Enlightenment era was really all about. And it came down to this notion of reason. You know, reason to people who are enlightened thinkers is the main reason or the main source of authority and legitimacy. So you have to understand that people in power up to this time point were typically in power because they inherited the role or because they believed God made it their will, that they would be the one in charge or they would be speaking for God. And I'm not saying anything negative about religion. I will say that up until this time period in Europe, that many people used religion to justify their own needs or to justify their own ambitions. And what the enlightened thinkers were talking about is we can break free from that way of thinking, and reason really is the basis of true authority. What makes something real or legitimate or really the way it should be is going to be based on logic. And some of the best traits that come from the enlightenment period are going to involve the concept of reason. They're going to involve individualism. It means being able to do things and think things for yourself. Skepticism, which is asking questions or doubting things that don't make sense to you. And of course, science. These are all concepts and ideas that came from the Enlightenment period. And once again, would impact the way we look at a lot of things in our country that we currently have, including the way our government runs, the securing of individual rights for individuals, and even the conversations we still have versus science and religion, that type of thing. In general, the Enlightenment pushed some really, really, well, pretty popular ideas today. They pushed the ideas of liberty, Enlightenment thinkers would have pushed the ideas of progress. They would have pushed the ideas of tolerance. Well, I know that's something we still learn about and teach in schools is tolerance for other people. Something else that we probably all should definitely take time to learn more about is this concept of a constitutional government. Starting to question the need for monarchs and kings and queens and stuff like that. And of course, something I think is one of the hallmarks of our founding fathers' efforts is the separation of church and state. And believe it or not, this gives more freedom to both sides. If you are somebody who is really focused on their religious faith, hey, more power to you. But by separating the church and state, there's less limitations on you to have those beliefs. There's less limitations on your values. It's when government starts to attack those values that your religion is really at stake. And it's the same thing on the other hand. You don't want religion having too much power over our government because that's going to impede the beliefs of other people too. And these are concepts that weren't really necessarily in action until Enlightenment thinking, but eventually would grow to become very popular. And when we talk about the Enlightenment era specifically, there's one guy, and I mentioned earlier, who's really kind of the father of it all. And we like to give the name or the title father to people all the time, like father of our country is George Washington, father of the Constitution is James Madison, father of democracy is a guy named John Locke. Well, the father of the Enlightenment era is a guy named Rene Descartes. Now, Rene Descartes was a Frenchman. So, yes, the French did give us a whole lot more than just French fries and kissing. By the way, they didn't invent French fries. That's a myth. But a lot of our great thinkers in history came from France. And I think that sometimes we lose the amount of influence the French really had on our way of life and the government that we have in our country today. So we need to give them their just due. And we're going to start with a guy named Rene Descartes. And that's an important name. So I'm going to put him in yellow because I want you to remember that name. And Rene Descartes, to be more specific, just so we know, was a devout Catholic. And a lot of his beliefs, he had to find some ways to reconcile that with his religious faith because he didn't want to compromise his position with the church because the biggest fear people had back then was to get kicked out of the church, which would have been called excommunication. Excommunication was worse than torture, was worse than death, because now you had no place to go in the afterlife if you were kicked out of your church. And he believed enough into the world as it was at that moment to believe that that was a serious threat. So he was. There's conversations we can have to explain how he tried to reconcile the two and balance the two beliefs between science and faith, and the ability to question things and not actually go out against God, because some people in the church would have said that was a big sin, but that's a whole different conversation. He was a true Catholic. He was a mathematician. I'm going to spell that wrong. I fixed it. It's beautiful now. And as a mathematician, he was the guy who was able to link algebra with geometry. So if you love math, you're going to love that. If you hate math, well, you can blame him for making your work a little bit more. He was a scientist and he was a philosopher. And philosophy is a big part of the Enlightenment era, but it's a big part of some of the ideas that came out of that time period and the influence it's had on our society in a whole, not just the United States, but the world in general. And when we talk about all these traits and all these different things, it really comes from a really simple phrase or really simple statement that Descartes came up with in his writing. It was very simple. I think, therefore I am. Now, I know if you are a normal human being, you're going to look at that and say, what in the heck was that dude talking about? Well, I like to send people back to the movie The Matrix. If you have never seen that, it's a great movie with Keanu Reeves. It's the original one, not the other stuff that came afterward. And if you watch that movie, and to give props to my professor that I learned from in college, a guy named Ethan Kleinenberg at Iowa State University, he went on working somewhere on the East Coast now. Great, great teacher. And he said, hey, if you've ever seen The Matrix, that's what this is all about. It's about questioning society, and the only thing you can count on is you. And if you watch the movie and you listen to the second part of this video, it'll make more sense to you. But think before I am. We're going to come back to that in just a minute, okay? So as I talk about the old Enlightenment period, I talk about Rene Descartes. I've got to talk about Rene's belief in how you can't look at society in the world and understand what's real and what's not real. See, this is according to Descartes. This was his logic, his reasoning he used. He said, we are all controlled by our senses. Now, what's that mean? Well, pretty simple. You got a fellow sitting here with big eyes. He's got a nose. He's got a mouth with a tongue sticking out. He's got some ears. The little hand sticking out here. That's our dude. You take that guy. We're going to give him a red tongue because that's what we have is red tongues. And we're going to say, okay, what are this guy's senses? Well, he's got sight, which means he can see things. He can hear because he can hear things. He can smell because he has a nose. He can taste because that's what he uses his tongue for. And of course, he has the ability to touch. And that sense of feel allows him to know what things are based on what it feels like. So anytime you compromise one of these senses, the other senses will typically kick in and make compensate for it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So if you lose your sight, sometimes your hearing gets better. If you lose your taste or smell, maybe other senses will kick in and help you out a little bit. You get more acute with your eyes so you can see what you're eating, that type of things. So all these things we have, you would think you could trust them. But Descartes says that's not true. You cannot trust these things. These things can be fooled. And I'm going to write that down. But we can be fooled by those senses. And I usually put like a little cloud here, like you're thinking, you're pondering, what's he saying? We can be fooled. Well, yes, you can be fooled by your senses. And that happens to us all the time. You think you look at a piece of pie, say, man, that looks so good, that smells so good, you taste it, it's like, oh man, that gal can't cook at all. Or maybe you look at a ride that looks really, really scary and you get on and say, man, that wasn't that bad. Or maybe you look at some food and say, oh, I can eat that. And you get halfway through and you say, man, that's a lot bigger than it looks. Our senses can be fooled. And what Descartes said, he said, listen, everything about us can be fooled. I mean, how do you know what's real? Take a chair, for example. And this is his example. He said, let's take a chair. How do you know that chair is real? You know it's real because it looks real, right? You've got the wood, it's brown colored, you can sit in it, you can touch it, you can smell the wood. but maybe it's not real. How do we really know that that chair is real? Because your senses tell you that. Now, this is where that story, The Matrix, comes in. Because if you ever see the movie, the guy in The Matrix, he's actually living a lie. He's plugged into this giant computer, and he really, none of the things he thinks are real are actually real, and until he gets woken up and realizes this whole other reality. And that's kind of what Descartes saying. We don't know that's a chair. And he says this because we can't trust our senses. So what he says you can trust, though, is the fact that you exist. And you exist because you're the one asking the questions. We'll go back and say that again. We can only trust that we exist. And in turn, because we're the only ones that we can trust, then we should be compelled to question everything else. And keep in mind, if you have ever learned anything about scientific method, you know that you throw out all other information and only trust the information that you collect. It's the same concept. He's talking about life in general. Now, he did have a caveat to that. He did because he was trying to reconcile with religion. He didn't want the church to be mad at him. He says, "Oh, you can trust God exists too." He said, "God, you don't have to question God. Everything else you got to question." And if you are going to question that, you say, "Well, how do you say that, Descartes?" Well, Descartes justifies that with something called the infinity. This is how we know God exists. And we know this because we as human beings understand divinity exists, but we can't comprehend it. And because God is all existing and goes on forever, he put just enough of that concept inside of us to know that it exists, but not enough in there to help us understand or comprehend it. Thus, we are never going to be on the level of a God, but we understand that God can exist, and because of that, you shouldn't bother questioning God. Just focus on everything else, which is science, which is society, which is the world around you, because those are things you can question. Don't question yourself. Don't question God. Just question everything else. And if you can do that, then all of a sudden you can move our society forward. And that's where this concept of liberty and progress and tolerance and maybe eventually developing a constitutional government and doing protections between church and state and making sure that human beings are influencing their government and they're not doing it based on a specific belief that might intrude on somebody else's. These are all concepts that came from this reasoning method that he went through to really open the door for people in many ways to question the world around them. And that questioning is what progresses us and moves us forward as a society. Thank you, Rene Descartes. You are better than people give you credit for. Great man, great historical contributor. and definitely the father of the Enlightenment era. Any questions? Awesome. You can Google it, you can watch the video again, or you can send me an email and ask for a little more, and I'll do what I can to give it to you. Thank you.